It is now my pleasure to invite on stage Mr. Shivshankar Menon, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at SAARC, former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, and former Foreign Secretary of External Affairs, Government of India, to deliver his address. Mr. Menon, please.
Good afternoon, and I am not here to destroy your digestion. Considering what you've just heard a brilliant panel with very rigorous analysis, but there was a fair amount of pessimism in there. I'm not going to be a pessimist, because what I'm speaking to is not really the internal politics of South Asia, but South Asia in the new geopolitics. And so what I'd like to say is a few words about how the evolution of South Asian politics affects our ability to deal with the rest of the world, what it has done, and then to say what the new geopolitics around us is and how that in turn affects us in South Asia. So to start with changing South Asian politics, I won't repeat what people have said before, but if you look at the sorts of changes we've seen, it's not only the shifting demographics, the so-called middle class that we're dealing with, the rise of new authoritarian leadership, but it's also allied with, if you look at the last 3 decades, very rapid economic change, economic growth in most of South Asia, particularly in Bangladesh, in India as well. The end of the civil wars in Sri Lanka and Nepal, and these have enabled actually a quickening of the pace of South Asia's integration into the rest of the world, whether it's with, and particularly with Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. What the globalization decades have done to South Asia, in a sense, is to increase that integration, particularly in traditional trade, not so much in terms of joining global value chains, but in terms of trading relationships. If well over half of South Asia's GDP today is accounted for by merchandise trade or imports and exports of goods, if you add services, it's more than that. For countries like Sri Lanka or Maldives, the proportion is much higher. Proportion is lower for the others. Even for India, today, over half our GDP is accounted for by imports and by merchandise trade. Compare this to 1991, when we started radical reform, when the proportion was 15.3%. So we have actually, through a process of change, actually now got linked. Other forms of integration with the world, with the rest of the world, are not growing very fast, but within South Asia you have an interesting phenomenon. Trade within South Asia accounts only for about a little more than 6%. 20 years ago it was about a little less than 5%. So really that hasn't changed very much. But you look at all the other forms of integration within South Asia, and Pakistan is the exception to this. It's actually, it's growing, whether it is inland water transport, whether it's connecting electricity grids, whether it is oil pipelines, whether it's just road travel, bus, railways. All these links have grown tremendously in the last 20 years. So you have a different form of integration going on within South Asia and between South Asia and the rest of the world to what I think people in Southeast Asia are used to. There is a classical model of globalization, you know, what Davos man speaks of. That's not what South Asia is doing at all. And I think we need to look at how we are building these linkages and really study it a little more carefully, because we are forming a pattern of our own. Within South Asia, you've just heard the political results, the last panel, I think, of a rapid process of urbanization, of growing inequality. You've seen the political consequences of the rise of the so-called middle class. But for me, what really matters, and I look at it now from the external point of view, is really the rise of new majoritarian political parties which consider themselves the natural ruling parties, or the natural parties of governance. And they're all new. Here again, I keep saying Pakistan is the exception, but PTI I think could count as new. The old traditional political parties have either split or been transformed or been converted into the vehicles of new authoritarian leaders who have made them into their personal vehicles. And the rise of the new authoritarian leaders and this shift in what are regarded as, or the parties that think they are the natural parties of governance, has led to two problems from an external relations point of view. One is they base their legitimacy primarily on charisma and nationalism, ultra-nationalism. Again, true across the board. And the result, therefore, is that their capacity to compromise, to bargain, to do the give and take that diplomacy and negotiation requires is much lower than it used to be, say, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. This, at a time when you are much more integrated, which is another way of saying you're much more dependent on the outside world, your flexibility in dealing with that world has actually gone down. So the political capacity to go and make the compromise, do the negotiations, isn't there anymore. And that's not actually a very good phenomenon. You can see it look at sub-regional institutions, SAARC. Most of them have become ineffective. And this is a direct result of our domestic politics and the evolution that our politics have taken. They're either SAARC is being held hostage to India-Pakistan relations, something that we used to fight to avoid. But it's also prevented some of the economic integration measures. What it also means is that foreign policy issues are now decided because of majoritarian politics at home on the basis of their domestic political impact to a much greater extent than they were. They always were. I mean, domestic politics is what every politician has to take into account. But foreign policy used to be dealt with traditionally on the basis of how it would affect your standing in the world and how you dealt with it. No longer. Foreign policy is now one more tool in domestic politics. And you can see in the foreign policies of most of these countries that there is no reliance on an international order or an external situation. Nobody in South Asia has taken anything to an international institution, multilateral institution, in the last 20 years. If anything, we've tried to avoid getting into international commitments. And this is true not just of India or of a larger country like India, but of all the countries of South Asia. Because our perception of our self-interest has changed too in these decades. In some of our countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, it was recognized until recently that rapid economic growth was a result of opening up to the rest of the world. That is being questioned now. For the first time, there is questioning, but we are now in a situation today, in India, for instance, there's an increasing body of opinion which says that free trade agreements have actually increased India's trade deficit and that this is not a good thing. But that's happened at a time when we are more dependent on the world than we ever were before, as I just told you, over 50% of GDP. And where your capacity to deal with that situation, to negotiate your way out of it, has also diminished. But the other concomitant of that awareness of this integration with the world is a growing realization of the importance of the Indian Ocean to us, because it carries our trade. India, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, now Seychelles, Mauritius as well, have been working together on maritime security in the Indian Ocean now since 2010. Something like that in the Bay of Bengal is probably long overdue. But basically what we have seen is that while during the globalization decades and for a while after the world economic crisis of 2008, economics was in command, basically. Majoritarian politics is now making that harder and harder, and will actually change the direction, the manner in which South Asia actually deals with the rest of the world. But these shifts in South Asia and in the way South Asia sees its own interests and dealing with the rest of the world have happened at a time when Asian and world politics have also changed in fundamental ways. Of course, the basic way is the end of the Vasco da Gama era, with the shift of the center of gravity of world politics and the economics to Asia, back to Asia. The rise of several emerging economies, China foremost, but also others, and by fundamental shifts in the balance of power around us. Today, if you look at the new geopolitics around us, you have a world which is economically multipolar, but militarily still primarily unipolar. If you look at the US Navy, for instance, or US defense budget, it's equivalent to the next 8 countries put together. The Royal Navy, you know, before World War II, World War I, used to use a 2-navy standard. They had to be equivalent to the next 2 navies put together. The US Navy, in terms of combat effectiveness, not counting China's Grey Fleet, is equivalent to the next 7 navies put together. Now, so the military balance is completely is askew as far as the economic balance is concerned. The last time we had this kind of situation was really before the First World War. But if you look at it politically, therefore, we're thoroughly confused. There is no political order left, because no political order can function without both an economic basis and some balance of power calculus which drives it. So today, frankly, for many people in China and the US, the world faces a bipolar future. The US is doing its best to prevent that, to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor. China is trying its best to make sure it is a bipolar future. And the result is, of course, Sino-US contention. Whether it's going to be bipolar or not is not the point. The fact is they both think this is a real possibility and will act on it. And the collision between China's desire to be great again and between the US desire to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor is really determining the geopolitics of Asia right now, at this moment. So what does this mean for South Asia? For much of the Cold War, South Asia was peripheral to superpower contention, a sideshow to the Cold War, even though all the killing fields of superpower contention during the Cold War were in Asia, were in a belt from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. South Asia was, in a sense, the exception. It fought its own wars, but after 71, that was it. We stopped. For our own reasons, not for external reasons. And throughout that period, I mean, India, for instance, accounted for less than 2% of world GDP. Today, accounts for around 8%. But as the center of world politics and economy returns to Asia, the Indian Ocean, South Asia become more important, and to the new superpower contention, which now is China versus the US, We see the increasing frequency with which the Chinese Navy is active in the Indian Ocean. We've also seen the two most important BRI corridors lead ultimately to the Indian Ocean, whether it's through Myanmar, whether it's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We've seen the US renaming her Pacific Command the Indo-Pacific Command and declaring a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So the significance, the importance of the Indian Ocean and therefore of South Asia as the peninsula which is central to the geography of the Indian Ocean has increased. You have this strange phenomenon of Nepal being courted to be part of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and of course by China to be part of the BRI and development. But it's logical, because Nepal is next to Tibet and therefore acquires a salience and an importance which maybe she didn't have since the 50s, at least to the superpowers. You've seen a huge expansion in China's commitment to Pakistan since 2013, which can also be seen as part of this process of South Asia becoming an arena of great power contention. But does this mean that this sort of integration of South Asia into Asian geopolitics, does this mean that we're in for turbulent times, that our politics are, that we're actually going to be dragged into conflicts, other people's conflicts? I don't think so. And this is where my optimism comes into play, and I promised you I wouldn't destroy your digestion. But let me tell you why I think it won't. It won't lead us into, because there are limits to, I think, the interest. There are three big reasons. One is the Indian Ocean, very significant. I mean, over 70% of the world's traded oil goes through the Indian Ocean, you know, container traffic. I don't have to say this in Singapore, how significant it is. But it's an open geography. And if you look at it in history, it has always been a peaceful ocean of trade and commerce and travel, rather than, unlike the closed seas, unlike the Mediterranean, unlike the seas near China, South China Sea, East China Sea, closed seas, after all, ultimately we carry our quarrels from the land to the sea. And the temptation in closed seas is for people to think that they can control them, that they can actually dominate them, and to think of them territorially. Even at the height of Pax Britannica, the Royal Navy never controlled all 10 choke points around the Indian Ocean. And the geography itself of the Indian Ocean keeps it an ocean of trade, of travel, and keeps it peaceful. Because frankly, it's even today's technology doesn't allow you to. The second reason is because, frankly, South Asia's economic development and attractiveness and its lack of integration into global value chains, the precise things that we complain about, also mean that there are limits to the economic interests of the outside powers in South Asia. There is only so much that they can expect out of South Asia. And I think there will be superpower interest in getting South Asia to pick sides, to act on their behalf, but there is enough room there for South Asia still not to. And lastly, and this flows from our politics, our own domestic preoccupations in South Asia itself mean that getting involved in the rest of the world's quarrels, in whatever might emerge in the larger Asian geopolitics, is unlikely to be attractive to the new majoritarian, authoritarian leaders that we have. Because for them, frankly, it's the remaking and the control and the power of over their own societies and economies that really matters. They are much less internationalists than their predecessors were. And this has nothing to do with whether they were colonially educated or not. It's just that each of them has a project of remaking their own societies into something which is very different from what they have known. And therefore, it seems to me that their temptations to get involved in the geopolitics, fractious as they are of the rest of Asia and of the world, are not going to be so high. So, in other words, therefore, it seems to me most likely that while South Asia will continue this process of slow, steady integration economically and politically into the geopolitics, it's not going to have the same kinds of effects that we are seeing it have in Northeast Asia, where it has already led to a whole new nuclear weapons state. It's led to a militarization of both the enclosed seas. You've seen all the regional flashpoints are now actually back in contention. But at the same time, I don't see that the impetus within South Asia, either from the geopolitics or the economics, to actually try and resolve our own internal disputes. The trouble is, if you ask around in South Asia, everybody thinks that the future is going to be better for them still. They all think they're going to be more powerful, more capable down the road. So they're quite happy to postpone resolution of any disputes, actual negotiations. We're not even engaged actually on most of the issues that divide us among ourselves. And they all think we'll do it when we're in a better position later, as long as everybody thinks so. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. But as long as they all think so, you have peace. But you have an unsatisfactory peace. So what I can foresee, therefore, is that we may actually be, geopolitically speaking, in our Goldilocks moment, where the porridge is not too hot, not too cold, but just the right temperature. She's now geopolitically significant enough to attract attention, have a say, but not so important as to face the risk of being dragged into great power conflict and contention. And we can go ahead with our own development and growth. Thank you. That's why I'm an optimist.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Please be seated. I would now like to invite Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at ISAARC and former Comptroller and Auditor-General of India, to join Mr. Menon on stage for the question and answer session.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming for this lovely session. You had food and you had thought from the podium also to accompany your food. So we've had a remarkable time. And from no less a person than Mr. Shivshankar Menon himself, who's been there all over the place in South Asia and done it all also. As far he represented India in Sri Lanka, he represented India in Islamabad, so he's been all over South Asia and seen politics of South Asia unfold from these places. He's put together a scintillating hypotheses, and I think we should now throw it open for discussion. Hopefully, the points that he made was the integration of South Asia into geopolitics will be slower or less than what the other states have been. Indian Ocean coming center stage, yet being an open ocean. We talked about economic interests of superpowers in South Asia. And finally, that the interests of authoritarian leaders in South Asia, more domestic oriented in kind of setting right their own administration or their governments and not looking out to other nations. Now, these issues are thrown open, and I think we need to discuss and debate them. So the floor is all yours. Yes, a gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Kul Gautam from Nepal. I used to be with the United Nations for many, many years. I think we appreciate Ambassador Menon's very optimistic and positive outlook on the integration of our region with the rest of the world. But the reality also, as you mentioned, is that South Asia continues to be the least integrated region in the world. If you compare with Latin American countries or African countries or Middle Eastern countries, ASEAN, as you yourself said, look, our trade is $1 trillion with the rest of the world, only 50 billion within South Asia. So what can be done? To me, that's not a very optimistic scenario, from 5% to 6%. One effort to try to have better integration was through the creation of SAARC. SAARC, as we know, has become defunct now, essentially. I remember one effort to try to revitalize that was through the Gujarat doctrine, which talked about, the large country being more magnanimous, non-reciprocal agreements, so that there would be greater integration, greater collaboration. It seems like the Gujarat doctrine is dead. Is it dead or is it still alive? You've been a long time diplomat serving in the National Security Council. I'm sure you would have some perspective, because many of us thought that when Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister first time, remember he invited all the heads of state of SAARC countries. What a wonderful beginning. Neighborhood first, none of that now. So my question is the Gujarat doctrine still alive?
Yeah.
Because to me, that offered some hope for real integration.
Thank you. Would you like to answer, or should we take a couple of more questions?
I'm happy to answer.
Okay, go ahead, I think.
Firstly, about South Asia being the least integrated. I think as long as you look at trade, yes, that's true. And that's the way economists look at integration. But if you look at diaspora, you look at influence, you look at, say, any services, for instance, you look at various other factors. You look at the significance of what you are to, whether it's internet data, which most, in fact, I think some calculations show that over 80% of the world's data flows through undersea cables through the Indian Ocean. So in those senses, actually, it is integrated with the rest of the world. I think you need to broaden your definition. As long as you look at trade and goods, yes, it's true. You're around 6% or so. But, and I think you're moving to a world now where that matters less and less to the way business is conducted. Today, with services, it's very hard to apply any rules of origin to services. Where are services actually produced? Where do you tax them? These are things that nobody actually has really sorted out. And so I think you need to look at it slightly differently. But within SAARC, also, the same logic applies. Yes, we do almost no formal trade with each other, very little. For India, less than 16% of our foreign trade is actually in the Indian Ocean region. Forget about SAARC. So most of our foreign trade is outside sort of Malacca to Suez. But if you actually look at the subcontinent as a whole, our real trade is probably 3 times the official figures. With Pakistan, it certainly is. Most of it goes through Dubai, through Singapore, through Colombo, through various places. With Nepal, it's an open border. So what doesn't show up in the figures, officially we call it smuggling, it's still trade. And somebody is making a living out of it and doing fairly well. And this is true of every one of our neighbors, at least on the land borders, where so I'm very careful about going by those figures. Secondly, these are all economies where a very large proportion is gray or black. So I have grave doubts about using the figures we have. But you look at the other linkages, India and Nepal, you look at students, you look at people working in the other country, you look at marriages across the border. There are parts of India where the MPs who go for their elections cannot reach their own constituency without going through Nepal. You look at the India-Bangladesh border, you look at all the stuff that goes across it, quite apart from the people and the cows, but you look at the border hearts and the demand for those border hearts. You look at all the inland waterways which actually connect us. You look at the grid connection. So the actual whether it's language, whether it's food, whether it's ethnicities. There isn't a border and boundary in South Asia which doesn't have the same ethnicity on both sides. We call them Mizos in India, the Chins in Myanmar. You show me another area, another part of the world which has as many things in common as South Asians have. There isn't. There just isn't another. So I really think we need to broaden our definition of what we look at, rather than just looking at it from a classical economist or, at least an Adam Smith point of view.
Thank you.
Sorry, about SAARC and so on. So if SAARC didn't work, do something else. I mean, that for me, it's only a form. It's only a means to an end. And I think there are many other things going on, whether it's BIMSTEC, also bilaterally between us. We've just opened up the oil pipeline for the first time between India and Nepal this week. There's a whole set of things going on in reality. But that's another thing we have in common throughout South Asia. We love to do ourselves down. We love to say, isn't it terrible, the world is bad. But you ask every South Asian, how's it going? He says, terrible. How are you doing? I'm doing okay.
Yeah, Mr. Pandey, you want?
So SAARC is a disappointment, I think we've talked about, especially when we look at it from the ASEAN perspective from here. Is it because of the dominant position of India? In ASEAN, there is no one dominant country. In SAARC, India is disproportionately dominant, about 80% of the GDP. And the elephant in the room is the Indo-Pak relationship. Do we see SAARC becoming something if the Indo-Pak relationship is finally solved, despite the Kashmir story now?
Well, it seems to me that India's size has been a fact, with or without good, no matter what the state of India-Pakistan relations is. Good India-Pakistan relations, bad India-Pakistan relations. India's size has been common, and its overwhelming presence in South Asia. The fact that SAARC has worked at times when India and Pakistan have got along suggests that it's not India's size that matters, that is not what prevents cooperation. You're absolutely right. India-Pakistan relations have held SAARC hostage, and they found it useful to do this. But what happens? We find other ways of cooperating. And we do sub-regional cooperation, for instance, between India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, for instance, or between Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. And SAARC itself permits that. There is nothing in SAARC that prevents 2, 3, 4 SAARC members deciding on their own to do what they want without waiting for everybody to come on board. And that's what's been happening ever since India-Pakistan relations went downhill and deteriorated to the stage where we can't have a summit right now and haven't had one for years. So I'm less worried about the form of SAARC. Why SAARC disappoints ASEAN, I don't understand. Because SAARC never did anything with ASEAN, good days or bad. And I don't think SAARC was a vehicle for ASEAN to interact with South Asian countries. And I don't think it was ever intended to be. I think SAARC, by its charter, was designed to make sure that the politics of partition and of the creation of new nation states did not get in the way of economic and social cooperation and work together. And that's why SAARC was written the way, the charter was written the way it was. So in a sense, it was a way to try and overcome the negative consequences of 1947, at least on the economic side. It failed. So I think we should just accept that and now start looking at other ways of doing this, of doing the same goal. For me, this is not, we don't have to be wedded to something that doesn't work and keep flogging a dead horse. But this is a very unpopular point of view, by the way, and doesn't represent any official statement.
The lady there. You want to add something?
I think I just wanted to add to what our former National Security Advisor has said, because I think this narrative about least integrated region is a bit, it's often without really looking at facts. The point is that if you look at the trade figures, official trade figures also of each of the South Asian countries, other than India, you'd find that India would either be the #1 or among the top 3-4 trading partners. If you look at their investment figures also, I mean, Nepal, for example, 65% of their exports and 70% of their imports are destined to India. If you look at investments also, India would be among the largest investors in South Asia, including with Afghanistan, we're the #2 trading partner. Now, this is a country that we don't have a direct connection with, but we found ways to trade with them. If you look at assistance also, Bangladesh today, we have direct project assistance of $8 billion, and almost all of it has been utilized. The same is true of Nepal, where we have cumulative investments of $5 billion. You see Maldives, Afghanistan, where again we are among the largest investors. Sri Lanka under the FTA. And by the way, that for India has offered non-reciprocal access to the markets to almost all South Asian countries. So I think the narrative about it being least integrated is perhaps due to the fact that almost all these countries have trading volumes which are relatively small compared to India's overall trading volume, and therefore, when you average it, the figure comes down quite significantly. But you take each of the South Asian countries, you'll find that India constitutes a very significant part of trade, investment, and development assistance. Besides this growing connectivity, I mean, with Bangladesh, we now have 1,100 megawatts of power flowing. We've just, with Nepal, I think we have perhaps more power going in from India today than is being produced there, depending on the season. So all these factors, I think, need to begin. I would suggest that ISAS actually does a study on it to show to what extent we've actually in real life integrated, besides what former NSA said, is the informal and the gray area integration that is taking place.
Thank you, Javed. There was a lady there somewhere. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bhavya, and I'm an independent consultant. I'm just a recent graduate from Rajaratnam School of International Studies. My question is that during BJP's first tenure, PM Modi was really actively involved in foreign relations, promoting international engagements, and also trying to attract investments from overseas. However, in less than 6 months of the second tenure, we already see a kind of shift in focus towards more nationalistic agendas and promoting more ethnic affairs at home. So what kind of factors do you attribute this kind of shift in priorities to? Are they originated from domestic electorate-related pressures, or on account of some global developments or external developments? And do you expect this trend to intensify in the coming months? Because if the government is not focused on the domestic economy, we really have no say in the geopolitical stage globally.
Well, I don't think there's a diminution in his interest in foreign relations. In his first 6 months, he would have met with, he's meeting President Trump. He would have received President Xi Jinping later in October in India. He's already met with President Putin. In fact, he's actually traveling more in this term than you look at the average of what he did in his first term. So I don't think there's any diminution in his interest in foreign affairs or in the energy he devotes to that. But I think you will see, after all, he's come back with a bigger majority. And in a sense, I think he and the party will see that as vindication of what they did or started trying to do in the first term. They also have the experience of the first term. They now know how to run a government, and they have a much clearer idea of what they want to do. So I think you'll see the kinds of initiatives that you've seen on domestic policy. And But ultimately, I think everybody agrees with what you said, that without a solid economic basis, without economic growth and development, the foreign policy, the geopolitics, the rest of it actually loses its steam. After all, if short summary of why India's had a very active and relatively successful foreign policy over the last 30 years is because of over 6% growth for that period, throughout that period. And also because over time, increasingly, India was willing to redefine her interests and to start acting responsibly as a power, first immediately within the subcontinent, then in the extended neighborhood. And you can see that process steadily over time. But nobody would, I think, question your fundamental assumption that the economy is what needs to be handled properly and needs to continue to grow. You're absolutely right. But I don't think you'll see a diminution in interest in foreign policy. As I said, if over 50% of your GDP is dependent on the external sector, you'd better be engaged with the world.
Thank you. Next. Yes, please.
I'm Narendra Agarwal, journalist. Just to follow up on your comment that 50% of our GDP is externally produced. So why is there reluctance from India to join the Regional Economic Cooperation Pact?
Well, I think, it's a natural phenomenon. It's those who feel that they will suffer from any step, whether it's joining RCEP or whatever, are the ones who will be most vocal. So throughout this negotiation, a few industries who feel that there will be short-term pain for them have really, you heard the Commerce Minister last week, I think it was, Piyush Goyal said, we can't let a few industries hold Indian policy hostage. So it seems to me that for us, there is a strategic reason to be involved in RCEP, to be part of RCEP. But the terms of it will need to be negotiated. And that distinction you have to, this is a negotiation, don't forget. And people give you more if they think you're not interested, if they want you in. So let's see. So I wouldn't judge the final outcome yet today. And I wouldn't say India is not interested. There are certainly industries who feel they'll get hit. There are certainly parts of Indian opinion, but the parts that matter, I think, understand. After all, how can India run an Act East policy, talk of an Indo-Pacific strategy, all this stuff, if you're not part of RCEP? I mean, it's not credible. So I am pretty confident that we'll come out on the right side ultimately. But I do hope that we are difficult enough to get the terms we want.
Yeah, there was, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yogesh from ISAS, previously at Stanford. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, Ambassador Menon. The central contention in some sense of your presentation today was this, that foreign policy is now being determined by domestic politics, rather than earlier it was just an influence. What does it tell us about Indian foreign policy today? Has it become more democratic? Or has it become more populist?
You notice I never use the word populist, either to describe leaders or to describe, because I don't believe these are populist. I think this is, what people think is popular. But nobody actually asks the people, are these what? What you're seeing is, and what we describe as populist, is really majoritarianism and with a steady dose of demagoguery in it, which is okay. I mean, the emotional appeal works up to a point. But I don't think it's as though you lay out the arguments for and against these policies and say, okay, to the people. And I'm not sure the people would choose if they knew all the consequences and what went along with it. So I'm a bit nervous about also giving the legitimacy that that term implies, because by saying populist, you're actually almost giving them democratic legitimacy. So these are not populist. But to what extent is foreign policy now democratized? Nobody asked the people. In the Indian system, actually, you don't even have to go to parliament for ratification of treaties. It's purely an executive function. It's a function of the executive. And this is not necessarily the most collegial government we've known in our history. So I don't see foreign policy, at the best of times, foreign policy is normally handled by a small group of people in most states, because it's not the daily bread and butter issues. Until you get to issues like RCP, most people, ignore foreign policy and leave it. And when a government is not too collegial and so on, and decision-making is very centralized at the top, I wouldn't say that therefore foreign policy is somehow more democratic. No. But it's used for domestic political effect. And that use is, and that cycle of, of feedback where timing, what you do is determined by how will it play at home. I'm sure it's always been a consideration, but it's never been so evident as today.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Good day, Mohan Singh, second generation Singaporean. I'm curious, you are an external security and national security advisor. Would you help walk us through the political and strategic calculations that the Indian government had when they went into Kashmir, and what is your, what's going to happen in the next few years? Will there be an intifada? Is this a stabilization, effort, or what do you see, and what would you advise the Indian government?
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask, actually, because I've been away from government now over 5 years, so I'm the last one who can. But I will advise freely. I'm a free man, I'm free to advise. It seems to me that if the government does what they say they are doing, the reasons that they put forward for taking these steps, which is development, which is also to take direct responsibility and eliminate what they call political middlemen in the process, and to change the pattern of Kashmir's dealings with the rest, with the central government certainly, and to try and make sure that the benefits of growth, of development, of central investment, all that gets to the people. Then obviously, this is a good thing they're doing. But I'm not sure that that's going to happen. And the longer you have to keep Kashmir under lockdown, the harder it is to believe that it will happen. Because why is a lockdown necessary? So my advice would be very simple. Would be open it up, start a political process, but deliver on your promises. And if you did that, that in itself would be a huge advance on what we've known in the past. But let's see. As I said, it's very easy to sit outside and say what you think. It's a different thing when you're actually in power and responsible.
Yes. Abhijit.
Hi, I'm Abhijit Raha. Mr. Menon, you spoke about SAARC, etc. My question I have for you is, in today's environment, when you have more a move towards bilateralism and less multilateralism, are these alliances or associations just more ideals and I guess more irrelevant in today's environment? Because when push comes to shove, countries will stand for their own individual interests.
Well, I think you have a very strong push towards bilateralism from the strongest power on earth. The US seems to have sort of given up on multilateralism, and at least under this administration. partly also under the previous, but not really to this extent. But there's a sort of, it's in inverse proportion to how strong people think they are. The stronger they think they are, the more they're likely to say, let's do it bilaterally, because they can bring their power to bear. The weaker they think they are, the less say they think they have in the system, the more likely they are to rely on a multilateral system where they can build alliances, work with others, balance the strong ones, and try and have a say in decisions. Today, with the new geopolitics and the fragmentation of global politics, and actually with the rise of alternate powers, all of whom think that the future belongs to them, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Japan, whether it's many of these, given the situation, you now have a situation, whether it's Vietnam, I mean, you can go through a long list of countries. Each one therefore thinks that they can use bilateralism where it suits them and multilateralism where they have to deal with somebody bigger than themselves. And so multilateralism is not dead. If you look at the number of new cases in the WTO, for instance, it's still roughly the same as it was before. But nobody is trying to build up the multilateral system, and trade is being regionalized. That's what our CP would represent in practice. Let's see where this goes. I'm not sure that you can deglobalize the world. It's very easy to say we're deglobalizing or we're decoupling, but I think there are limits to what we can do without actually causing real physical harm to ourselves. And I think leaders realize that. So they're testing the limits right now of deglobalizing, of demultilateralizing, even of decoupling. But I think there are limits which we are reaching quite soon to these processes.
We have some grace time left, 5 minutes possibly. Yeah, lady there.
Hi, my name is Ramya. And in relation to the India-US-China triangle, I was wondering if you see any shift in Indian policy with the Straits of Malacca and even with the Indian Ocean as well, and what this means if you do, both for the Southeast Asia and South Asia.
I'm not sure what you mean. If you listen to what Prime Minister Modi said at Shangri-La last year about the Indo-Pacific, and what he said was quite distinct from both what Secretary Mattis said and from what the Chinese normally say about these waters. So in terms of maritime security, I think what he was stressing was keeping all these bodies of water, which are interlinked, open, freedom of navigation, the things that will contribute, keeping them free, secure, and safe. So the things that would contribute to trade and to securing the space. And the way he described it, this was something that everybody had to work on, particularly the countries in the Indo-Pacific, but also the greater powers. I mean, powers like China and the US. And he said quite explicitly, nobody needs to be excluded. So I don't see that as a shift, but I see it as a summing up, in a sense, of an experience over several years of what we saw, and of this increasing influence of Sino-US contention, especially naval contention and rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, and an attempt to try and keep that out and under some kind of control. So for me, it's logical that India, Singapore, ASEAN, that we work together on this, because I think we have very similar approaches here. I mean, these are some of the world's greatest trading nations, and we should have a common interest, at least, in maritime security across this whole region. And I don't see why that should be a problem. The problem starts when you look at the ocean in territorial terms. Territory is zero-sum, right? It can belong to you or me. The ocean doesn't belong to people. I mean, the high seas doesn't belong to anybody. You can't control it. And this is why I said the Indian Ocean it's an open geography. Nobody can hope to control it, all the choke points around it, and therefore the ocean. Closed bodies of water tempt people to do silly things, like thinking they can control all the choke points, declare a Monroe Doctrine, say anything that happens here, I say yes or no. And that's part of the problem. So the Indo-Pacific includes both. Includes two open oceans, Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but these closed bodies of seas near China.
Shall we? Yeah, Dr. Akhtar.
Hi, so I'm going to press you on the elephant in the room again. And so this is how I'll put the question. You know, in Pakistan, it's the word that is bandied around regularly to capture the interests that would resist a détente with India is the establishment. And, you know, the army, but not just the army, right? There's now over 70 years, there's a generation of academics, of the intelligentsia, the media. So is there a similar constituency or you know, this multifarious set of interests that is actually opposed to peace with Pakistan, within India, within, you know, as an insider, how do you see this? Is it always Pakistan that is sort of resisting peace, or is there a significant constituency in India? And I don't just mean the Hindutva constituency, the ideological constituency. I mean, you know, sort of a set of interests that would, for whatever reasons you might be able to help us understand, would actually oppose an opening up with Pakistan.
You know, well, I think that slightly different situations in India and Pakistan, having lived in both. How do I put this? There's no, ideologically, previous NDA governments have not had trouble. In fact, some of our best times started under previous NDA governments, under Vajpayee, both as foreign minister and then later as prime minister when he came. I mean, he's made speeches at Minar-e-Pakistan in Lahore, which, you know, liberals would be proud to own. So I don't think there's an ideological problem in India. I think what's happened in India is we had the euphoria of sort of 2004 to 2007, but Mumbai then actually destroyed that. So there is the active constituency for better relations with Pakistan actually sort of immediately shrank. And there's very little public purchase for the idea anymore. Quite unlike the situation in 2004, 5, 6 when it was popular. You know, it's easy to blame a system, the establishment, but these are all amorphous sort of ideas. But the other thing that has happened, and this is true in both Pakistan and India, is that because domestic politics drives and leaders believe that this plays well, and ultimately if your legitimacy depends on ultranationalism, and then this is a very useful card to play. So you today have and I'm sure High Commissioner will disagree with me, but I believe personally that on both sides of the border, there is an interest in a managed and controlled level of hostility. It serves a lot of interests. It's good for budgets, it's good for, you know, it's good for political control. I don't need to go through this. We can, yeah, I mean, it has all kinds of advantages. And it has political, but it's controlled and managed. I'm not saying we're about to go to war. In fact, the moment we came close to it, we quickly ran away from it. Both sides de-escalated very quickly. But because there's this common sort of political interest right now, you'll get this, you're at a new equilibrium, which is not a very happy equilibrium, and certainly if you're well-meaning people who want nothing but the best, you know, this is not the way to go. But there are, I think, institutional and other interests which keep this going. Now, that's a pretty grim thought. But there's a whole industry now So therefore I kept saying Pakistan is the exception to everything I say, whether it's about integration, whether it's about, you know, the actual levels of how much we have in common and what we're doing. You know, Pakistan is the constant exception. And I think sadly, from my point of view, Pakistan has become much less South Asian and much more West Asian in the last decade or so, in many respects. And apart from, you know, Pakistan worrying about Afghanistan and India, I don't think Pakistan worries too much about the rest of South Asia anymore. And I suppose maybe that's a direct consequence of 1971, I don't know. But in historical terms, I think that's where it's going.
So I guess optimism has to prevail. We have to bring this conversation to an end. I've been given a time limit and I have to adhere to it. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for a lovely presentation of Dr. Menon. Thank you.